So I've read the book, and I realized something about it. This isn't actually a book about depression, is it?
What do you mean?
That's not what it's about.
Tell me more.
This is a book about how society is screwed up.
Yeah.
Is it not?
I think the fact that our society is screwed up is what's made us depressed and anxious to a really significant degree. So I think they're interconnected. But I think that's a fair point, actually. It's a diagnosis of what's going on with our culture that's made so many of us feel so bad.
I mean, it felt to me reading this that you had snuck in a genuinely thorough-growing critique of modernity under the guise of a book about depression and anxiety, which I'm not saying is a bad thing. I think it's really interesting. But what was fascinating to me reading the book was that you are very, very concerned that we have gotten this. And when I say this, you can't see it on a podcast, but I'm waving my arms to signal all of it. You seem to me to feel that we have gotten this pretty profoundly wrong.
You know, I'm glad to be alive today, and there's lots of things about our culture that we do right. But one of the things I learned from speaking to scientists all over the world, over 40,000 miles, is that we've quite deeply misunderstood things like depression and anxiety. And one of the things that kind of connected the critique of a lot of the scientists that I met, the critique from the World Health Organization, is, I think it can be summarized in, everyone listening to this knows that they have natural physical needs, right? You need food, you need water, you need shelter, you need clean air. If I took them away from you, you would be in real trouble real fast. But there's equally strong evidence that we have natural psychological needs, right? You got to feel you belong. You got to feel your life has meaning and purpose. You got to feel that people see you and value you. You got to feel that you have a future you understand. And our culture is good at lots of things, but we've been getting less and less good at meeting people's deep underlying psychological needs. There's lots of evidence for that. And I think that's one, it's not the only one by any means, but that's one of the key reasons why we have this spiraling depression, anxiety, and addiction crisis.
Well, help me with the evidence that it's getting worse, because this is something I was thinking about in the book. What is the evidence that we are becoming more unhappy, more depressed, more alienated? Walk me through the evidence that this is not just bad, but life has always been bad, but that there is some modern pathologies that are accelerating.
So one of the things I learned in all the research is that there's scientific evidence for 9 causes of depression and anxiety. There may well be other causes for which we don't yet have evidence. 2 of those causes are biological. There are things that in your biology that can make you much more sensitive to depression and anxiety. And 7 are factors in the way we live. And I don't think all of those factors have increased, but I do think some of them have increased. There's strong evidence some of them have increased. So I'll give you one example of one of the most powerful determinants, I think, which is loneliness. Professor John Cacioppo at the University of Chicago, who I've interviewed a lot, has proven that loneliness causes depression and anxiety. They don't just cause unhappiness. They are drivers of depression and anxiety. For a very kind of simple reason, as he put it to me, if you think about the circumstances where human beings evolved, right? We exist, we're able to sit in this studio for one key reason. Our ancestors on the savannas of Africa were incredibly good at one thing. They were incredibly good at banding together in cooperative tribes. They weren't bigger than the animals they took down. They were much better at working together. Every instinct human beings have is to be in a cooperative to be in a cooperative tribe. And, so just like bees need a hive, humans need a tribe. And there's really strong evidence that we are the first humans to really try to disband our tribes. There's a study that asks Americans, how many close friends do you have who you can call on in a crisis? And when they started doing it years ago, the most common answer was 5. Today, the most common answer, it's not the average, but the most common answer is none. So we've got this unprecedentedly lonely society. And as Professor Cacioppo put it to me, you think about the circumstances where we evolved. If you were alone and separated from the tribe, you were anxious and depressed for a really good reason. You were about to be eaten, right? You were in terrible danger. If you got injured, you would probably die. So I think that's one factor, for example. I can talk about others.
I want to stop you on that for a second, because you have a piece of evidence in the book that I'm very bought in on the loneliness research. I do think this is one of our truly severe social problems, but you had something I'd never seen before, which is that you can measure the lonesomeness of people all over the world by testing how often they wake up in their sleep. Yeah. And that was really, that's one of those ones that has rung in my head since I read it. Can you talk a bit about that research?
Yeah, and I was totally fascinated by this myself. So everyone experiences something called micro-awakenings in their sleep sometimes, which are, you wouldn't register them, but you wake up very slightly and then you go back to sleep. So you're roused a little. And one of the things we know is that when people feel lonely, they experience much higher levels of micro-awakenings. We think that's because if you went to sleep on the savannas of Africa for our ancestors and you were lonely, you would be right to be vigilant and keep waking up because you weren't protected by the tribe, right? That's Professor Cassiopo's best thesis, although, obviously it's hard to test that. But it's a very good proxy for loneliness. If people describe themselves as being lonely, they will certainly experience a lot more micro-awakenings. And one of the pieces of research Professor Cassiopo did is he went and spent time with this group called the Hudderites, who are even more hardcore than the Amish. They live in a very no electricity off the grid. And I went and spent time with an Amish community as well. And what he found is the Hudderites experience virtually no micro-awakenings in their sleep. So it's not that what this demonstrated is it's not just that loneliness is a kind of inevitable human malady, it's that it's a function of certain ways of living. There was another thing that Professor Cassiopo discovered about loneliness that I've thought about so much. I actually realised I'd misunderstood what loneliness is. I had thought social isolation and loneliness were the same thing, right? So if you say to someone, do you feel lonely? Virtually nobody has difficulty understanding what you mean and answering yes or no. But what he found that was really surprising is that social isolation and feeling lonely actually don't correlate that much. Actually, the number of people you interact with is not a good predictor of how lonely you feel. There's something else that's a predictor of how lonely you feel. So he gave this example to me. If you imagine, if you go, we're in DC, I've been to DC many times, but if I had come to DC for the first time and I went to the White House and I was standing in front of a crowd of people outside the front of the White House, I would be surrounded by people, but I would feel lonely, right? Or if you're in a hospital bed, you can push a button to get a nurse, they'll come straight away, but you'd feel lonely in that situation. And he said, well, why is that? And what he discovered is the situations that cure loneliness are not when you get access to other people. They're situations of mutual aid. So it does not cure your loneliness to just be given someone helping you or to be surrounded by other people. So the nurse comes, you still feel quite lonely. What heals human loneliness is if you feel that you have a reciprocal relationship where someone is giving something to you and somewhere down the line, they'll give something back to you. Helps to explain why in marriages, people become really lonely when they start to break down and you no longer feel you're in it with the other person. Do you see what I mean? So that to me is such an interesting insight about loneliness.
So give me then the broad piece of this within society. How did our society become an engine for loneliness?
I think it's a whole range of things. There was this research I learned about from a wonderful person called Dr. Brett Ford, who's at the time was at Berkeley. She's in Toronto now. And she really helped me to think about this. So she did this really interesting research with her colleagues. They looked at if you consciously decide you're going to spend more of your life trying to become happier, will you actually become happier, right? And they did this research in 4 countries. It was the United States, Japan, China, and Russia. And what they found is, if in the United States, if you consciously try to become happier, you do not become happier. But in the other countries, you do. And they were like, what's going on here? So they did more research. What they discovered was, in the United States, if we try to make ourselves happier, generally you do something for yourself. You try to make more money, you buy something for yourself, you spoil yourself, you show off on Instagram, whatever. In the other countries, most of the time, if you tried to make yourself happier, you did something for someone else. You tried to help your friends, your community. So we have an implicitly individualistic vision of happiness, and they have an implicitly collectivist vision of happiness. And it turns out our vision of happiness, we're just not that species, right? That's not who we are. That's not what our instincts are. It just doesn't work that well for us.